there seems to be a need for people to talk and for someone to listen. For ordinary folk to tell the realities of what life was like, so that their story also is recorded in one way or another. But often it is difficult to evoke these stories. These are narratives that are so deeply embedded in a traumatic psyche that to find the language often is difficult. And that's where we would need to look to these creative means. Certainly the visual and creative arts is one way. The work that I entered into trying to work with the archive of the ordinary was through ordinary family photographs, where I often didn't have to say much, but these banal little objects had the power to reveal so much that was hidden before. And I think it is incumbent on those of us who are dedicated to this project of making things work and making things work in a way that does justice to our past, to take the creative project seriously. It is not a project of aesthetics. It's not a self-indulgent peripheral one. And to use those tools at our disposal of the creative project, including dance and music, the oral tradition, to listen to those who carry the burden of our past. In so doing, it doesn't necessarily, I've noticed it doesn't necessarily change their living conditions, but there's a sense of relief that my story has been told, I matter in this, I too played a part. And I think that is where we need to begin to attend to the numerous injustices and injuries that plague our lives on a daily basis. And I frankly, I don't think we have an opportunity to do this again. We don't have the luxury of sitting for another 20 odd years, because goodness knows what will happen if we don't. We're sitting on a power keg. We see, particularly in the Western Cape, questions around land, questions around race. We don't know how to speak about things like coloredness. We trip over labels. And I think now's the time. This pandemic has offered us this chance to reset and reimagine and do the hard work that was necessary decades ago.
Tsitsi and Tamar, do you want to add something?
Maybe Tsitsi should go first.
Tsitsi?
Thank you, Professor Pumla. Yes, I was thinking exactly what Sheena said about the fact that we need spaces for people to speak and people to be heard. My experience in our cultures is often that people are not really expected to talk about their inner life. And this is what I was talking about when I mentioned the other side of some of our traditional cultures. They are very structured, they're very formulaic. And so people are not encouraged to understand the self as a self in process. The self is understood really more as a social construct. So I think we need to start achieving a balance. We understand that this idea of the self is something that emerged in modernity, that is said to have begun in Europe several centuries ago. And so it is not something that we have come to in a linear trajectory. And we have not even come into full modernity. That is why I called it quasi-modernity. There are pockets of life where people aspire to modernity, but actually the relations of modernity are such that that aspiration is meant to remain unfulfilled. It is partly because of that aspiration that modernity can exist at whatever level, whether it's the material level. The lack of Africa becomes the surplus of those lands and that area that is said to have entered into modernity. The lack of Africa in terms of representation therefore becomes the norm, and our lack of material that is out there narrating our stories becomes validation for lack of this material, exactly as Tamar told us, because these stories now are said to be inconsequential. They belong to bodies that really are not important, that nobody would even dream of grieving. So I think we need a space to recoup all of that, to say, look, this has been the trajectory. In some ways, there have been commonalities, but there has also been the specificity that Tamar spoke about. And I think it is in telling those stories and in hearing those stories that we will be able to cast away the shame that inhibits us often from engaging with each other at the level that we need to engage, that generates mistrust, that generates the behaviors that cause mistrust. I mean, the corruption that we see is real, but it is coming from somewhere. It has an origin and a source. It is not simply that African politicians are a corrupt species, if you like. We can actually trace trajectories that make it quite understandable that people who have been through such circumstances and developed in these ways will most likely end up behaving like that. In nervous conditions, there's the character of Nyasha who had bulimia. I often say to myself, this is another kind of material bulimia, a financial bulimia, where you cannot feel satisfaction. Now, to be unable to feel satisfaction is addiction. It is abnormal. So we're looking at circumstances that have been constructed in such a way that we cannot behave normally. We have to start understanding that and dealing with it. And it is only by telling these stories, not from a position of judgment, but from a position of compassion, and saying, yes, even these bodies have a story to tell. We may then need to talk about justice and other things. That is also valid, but we do have to begin from there. So I think storytelling is one of the areas where we will find the grace to reclaim our dignity and to save ourselves. And so it is not by accident that telling stories on the continent is so difficult. There was a reason why our societies were structured so that we could not express, because we are beings that express. In every society, you will see this push towards creativity. Now, the ways that were available for us of being creative in past versions of our society are no longer the kinds that have a great deal of social meaning. So we now need to enter into those ways of expression that have social meaning. And it is precisely at that level that it is made exceedingly difficult through the structures of those sectors. It is made extremely difficult for Africans to express. When you do, there are gatekeepers. So the expression is often not authentic. There are workshops, 2-week workshops here, 1-week workshop there. No, the person flies in from wherever they fly from, across oceans and seas, and they tell you, no, that's not the right way. A character shouldn't be like this. I mean, I have had terrible trouble publishing for that very reason, because my characters do not conform to what is accepted as the proper way of telling a story. And so I think we have to work very hard to create the spaces on the continent where we can examine our own inner landscapes and express them.
Tamar?
I think, I think yes to everything that's been said. But what I would say is it's difficult because what one's dealing with are multiple forms of repression and disabling. So there's disabling coming from outside, as Tsitsi says, there are gatekeepers, there are conventions, there are norms of writing, and there are institutions of publishing, and there are, certain voices that have platforms and others don't, etc. And we have to deal with those institutional frameworks through which self-narration can happen. But on another level, also at a psychic level and at an individual level, the task of facing one's life and one's past is powerfully dangerous, and we are psychically wired to resist and to block that painful unearthing and excavation of the past. But I think that is part of the collective job that we have to do. There's that famous Baldwin quote, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. James Baldwin said that. And I think I find that very powerful, because I think that the collective conversation that has to happen is a very, very painful one. And the forces to resist it from multiple sides, psychic and social and institutional, are huge. So yes, absolutely, I couldn't agree more. We need storytelling on multiple levels, because there's one thing to write a Booker Prize winning or shortlisted novel. There's another thing to create the spaces that Sheena's talking about, in which everyone's voice can be heard, whether they're in schools or community workshops or in informal environments where you create spaces for forms of narration, whether it's through song or music or dance or storytelling in all sorts of ways. And out of those thousands of stories, you hope that 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 will find the platforms and the voice to make those stories heard. But it's storytelling, I think, that has to happen on multiple levels, and from those very, very intimate, small, even family environments. I come from a family of Holocaust survivors. What is it to tell those stories? What is it? And in my own personal life in South Africa too, there are all sorts of stories which I won't go into now, which, what is it to confront those stories in one's own family, let alone in wider environments? And then what is it to craft those stories into what you call art, Pumla? Which is a different thing. Art is a different set of discourses and frameworks and platforms and whatever. That's another whole discussion. So I think there's work to be done in multiple sites and levels here, and I think they're all important. But I don't think they can be conflated.
Yeah, I think that absolutely agree with you, but also to say that part of these conversations, the storytelling themselves, it's calling from a different kind of imaginary, which we can then think of as creativity itself. It's not, the art or art as in, formal art, but it's more the aesthetics of conversations, the aesthetics of how do we think about the past? What is it that we think about? How do you bring it to the fore? And for me, actually, the mournable body, I absolutely understand, and I appreciate, the meaning to mourn, to grieve, to notice, to say something about this body. But it also reminds me of the psychoanalytic notion of mourning, which is very much what Tsitsi is talking about when she talks about, and all of you actually, when we talk about telling these stories, telling all of them, the shame, the trauma, the guilt, in all of their complexity. It's a kind of facing that past and facing the past and how it affects us in the present. It's a mourning, and in psychoanalytic terms, it's the mourning, the mournable body, which is to say, it's the body that calls us to account, calls us to face this past and to account. And I find that, the combination of, the story, the meaning in the book, and applying it to psychoanalytically to think about how we actually confront, how it calls us to, it's like, here is what is going on, here is Tambuzai, here is the collective, body of Tambuzai and everyone else represented there. And what does it mean that we are faced with that story, the crisis that we are at this present moment? I want to give this opportunity for Tsitsi to say something, and then I open it to the floor, just so that your voice, lands on the floor, and then people can respond with questions. We probably will go over about 5 minutes, but we cannot go over more than that in terms of the event itself. But this is so just brief comments, and I'll invite questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Pumla. I wanted to just pick up on what Tamar said and also what Sheena mentioned. And I agree that there are many levels of storytelling. One level of storytelling is when a child falls down and comes into the house crying and, Mom, what is the reaction? Is the child allowed to tell the story, Mom, I fell down because I was running away from the dog and I hurt my knee? Or is the mother so stressed and simply unable to relate that the child gets a smack across the face? There is that level. And then there are all the levels in between to those stories that everyone knows. Your things fall apart. That level of storytelling. And I think we need them all. And I think the one leads to the other. An empowering response to the child will tell the child, it is all right for me to speak about my pain. And that child will take that message to the next level. And so it will go on until we have conversations about our common pain. And then we will find that eventually the way we engage with that common pain shifts. And we find angles to the story that we hadn't thought about before. And the new stories that come out will actually find the lacunae of joy that were in those trajectories of trauma. And that is how we can bring about transformation. So while, yes, it happens at different levels, for me, at the end of the day, it's kind of like a symphony of stories that we have to keep going at all the levels.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here. I think it's almost sounds as if it has been addressed. It's a question, what can we do to get the politicians to listen to us more and adopt some of your very simple but powerful interventions, Tsitsi? This, I believe, can go a long way in making Africa, not just Zimbabwe, a great place.
Shall I speak to that very briefly? Thank you, Pumla, and thank you for the question. It's a wonderful question. I believe that politicians generally are focused on elections, and so they need something very compelling to make them look away from elections. And so I don't think that approaching them directly is going to work. I think we need to find ways of doing it for ourselves. And so my attention now is shifting to wealthy African people on the continent. We hear that one Zimbabwean has been named the UK's first British billionaire. Where is this person in this conversation? And there are so many of them on the continent. And I think that is where we have to start looking, because these processes that we speak about need to be resourced. When the politicians see how people react to these stories and how they move people and change people, transform them into agents, 21st century citizens who have agency, then they will begin to listen and want to be associated with those kinds of interventions.
We are going to end the session, and thank you very much to Sheena, Tamar, and thank you most of all to Tsitsi for giving us the opportunity to reflect on these questions. We would like to have you back, and actually I should mention here that Tsitsi is coming back in December, and hopefully for the first time back to Stellenbosch, not to Steers, and that we will have conversations with all three of them. So we're looking forward to that opportunity.